ESPN's Mike Rothstein tells us which Falcons players helped their chances of sticking on the roster with their performances on Friday night in Miami.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to an illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And if you don't know me, I am, of course, your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. You may also know me as Sirius Black. You may also know me as Mr. Drew. My friends call me Negative Nancy, but you can call me Mr. Drew. But you can become one of my friends by making this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. You know, become an everydayer by subscribing and following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode will be joined by ESPN's Mike Rothstein to break down his thoughts on the Falcons preseason matchup last Friday against the Miami Dolphins, who sort of helped themselves make the roster. And as a heads up, Mike and I recorded this Sunday morning before Falcons practice. And at that point in time, we didn't know that Michael Walker had been waived by the team. And I'll come back at the end of today's episode and give my thoughts on that move, as well as the signing of linebacker Frank Ginda. But without further ado, let's jump into that conversation with Michael Rothstein of ESPN right now. All right, everyone, we are back with another illustrious guest. He is none other than Mike Rothstein of ESPN. Mike is here to tell us about his thoughts on the Falcons' first preseason action against the Miami Dolphins, some of the things that we learned. Mike, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank you. I feel like it's been so long. I was saying before the show, you have an entire new studio and a new backdrop from the last time I was here.
Well, I just moved my chair slightly.
Hey, but that's all it takes. Like, that's what they say, Aaron. Like, you know, if you've lived in a place long enough, you have to mix things up and move things around slightly, and it gives it a new aesthetic. So I applaud your ability to find a new aesthetic.
I appreciate that. So, Mike, you know, people are tired of hearing my constant opinion on this podcast on what is the value of preseason games. Let's get your opinion on that. You know, what did we learn about the Falcons on Friday night?
Well, I mean, it really starts there, right? No, like, the honest answer is this. They played, three potential starters. I mean, Alford played a little bit in the slot, but really was getting more punt return reps, and they played him a little bit outside. And some of that was because I think Mike Hughes, you know, it seemed like he had gotten a little bit hurt. Didn't seem like it was anything serious based off what Arthur Smith said. But, you know, the second anyone got even a little bit of something in a preseason game, you're going to pull them. They did the same thing, it sounds like, with Frank Darby. We'll find out more today about both of those guys. So, you know, from a personnel standpoint, we didn't learn anything about the starters. We're not going to learn anything about the offense, more or less, because it's so vanilla and not game planned or schemed. But defensively, we actually learned a couple things, even with the backups in. And that is just the aggressive nature of which they are going to play. Because, again, remember, this is base. This is quote-unquote vanilla, right? They ran a ton. I mean, I counted, I think 3 or 4 safety or corner blitzes. Mm-hmm. You know, and got home on a couple of them too. If my memory serves, it's either Breon Borders or Natron Brooks that got home on one. Chapman got home on another, I think. Like, so you're seeing that, and you're seeing that in the preseason after they went 2 days against them with joint practices. That should tell you the fact that they're going to want to be aggressive defensively this year, and that they're going to blitz a lot more and send a lot more pressure than what we, I think, saw under Dean Pease. But that should not be a surprise to anybody, because if you've been listening to Ryan Nielsen, you've been listening to Arthur Smith, that's kind of what they've been saying without saying it for, honestly, a few months now. So I took that from it. I thought the depth looks pretty good. There were a couple guys who really stood out to me, Aaron, and they're guys who, in some cases, I still think are probably roster long shots, but you're going to pay a little bit closer attention to them, or I will the next 2 weeks. And then there are a couple other guys that, to me, have been roster bubble guys that might slowly be inching their way toward having a defined roster spot, potentially at the expense of a couple of other people. And I think there are a couple people who right now people think are roster locks that might not be, based off of what we saw and when they played the other night.
Well, let's get into some of those players. I know in your post-game notes that you mentioned sort of 3 stars of the game: cornerback D. Alford, cornerback Breon Borders, safety DeMarcco Hellams. You also had some honorable mentions for defensive tackle Albert Huggins, running back Godwin Igwebuike, and quarterback Logan Woodside. Are those some of the players that you're referring to that are sort
very
of
much so?
other players?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. Some of those guys. Remember, Breon Borders is going to be suspended the first 2 games of the year, so it is entirely possible that that ends up just being kind of a kick the can down the road type of conversation. But he was a roster long shot coming into this, right? Like they knew he was going to be suspended for those first 2 games when they signed him, so that was kind of a see what he has, give it a shot. He's played well. I mean, I was not in Miami for the game or for joint practices, so I watched it on television like y'all did. But he's made plays in the training camp practices that I saw, to where I kept noting him down. If you read my daily notes from practice, you will have noticed I've mentioned Breon Borders a few times now. Same thing with Albert Huggins. Albert Huggins is a guy to me that I'm not sure where he fits in, but they might need to try and find a spot for him, because he just keeps making plays. He's being aggressive. And don't forget this, he's a Ryan Nielsen guy. He came over from New Orleans. He didn't play last year because he was on injured reserve, but he played for him in 2021 and had a reasonable year for a depth defensive lineman. So Albert Huggins is a guy to me that I think 3 weeks ago no one was probably talking about in terms of a roster spot, where now you should at least be having a consideration of that when you're talking about their depth. The Logan Woodside thing, listen, I heard it on Twitter all night, and I felt like I could have just cut and paste with my response, because why aren't they playing Desmond Ridder? Well, they're not playing Desmond Ridder because Desmond Ridder got good work the last 2 days, and they were only going to put Desmond Ridder out there with the starters. Well, why didn't they play Taylor Heinicke? Well, they know what they have in Taylor Heinicke. Taylor Heinicke is a veteran. The difference is the rules this year say you can have a third quarterback kind of as that. Remember the old school emergency quarterback? You can have that, but the only way you can have the third quarterback is if he is on your 53. So you have to decide whether or not you want to keep 3 quarterbacks, and you need to get a good gauge of what you have or don't have in Logan Woodside. Now, Arthur Smith knows a lot about Logan Woodside, but you want to get a lot of work for him. I think P1, which we saw, and it would not shock me if most of P3 goes to Logan Woodside. Maybe P3 gets split between Taylor Heinicke and Logan Woodside. I would be surprised if we see Desmond Ridder anymore, unless it goes terribly on Friday against Cincinnati. I would be surprised if we see him any more than P2, frankly. Nor should we. Desmond Ridder gets hurt, you're in trouble, right? Same with a lot of other guys. So I thought Logan Woodside played well. I don't know if that answer comes yet. That answer might come, honestly, because of other roster spots and injuries there, Aaron. So those guys. D. Alford, I think everybody's in agreement. He's got a roster spot. The question is whether or not he's their punt returner too. Mm-hmm. And you got to wonder now if that's the case. And frankly, if you're the Falcons, you want D. Alford to win that job. Because if D. Alford wins that job, that opens up roster construction for you with that 53rd spot. So like an Albert Huggins, D. Alford wins that. Like, this is how you have to think, right? D. Alford wins that job as a punt returner. And let's just say, for argument's sake, Mike Hughes is kind of the guy you feel comfortable as a number 2 punt returner there in an emergency situation. Obviously, they could put Bijan back there in an emergency situation and say D. Alford got hurt. Well, okay. Well, what does that mean? Now you don't have to worry about carrying a guy who's solely a punt returner, especially since Cordarrelle's your kick returner. then that opens things up. Well, what do you want to do? You want to keep an extra defensive lineman, keep an extra offensive lineman, keep a different receiver whose skills are not necessarily as a returner. Godwin, who you mentioned, that's a really interesting question if they want to keep an extra running back. And also it goes to he has kick return skills. So if you want to make sure you have a backup for Cordero, and listen, Cordero's a fun player when he's healthy, but we've seen the last 2 years, you can't necessarily count on him for 17 games. And his backup is out for the year in Avery Williams. So you need to figure out who your backup kick returner is. And that might be Godwin. And Godwin's got some speed, man. I'll tell you, you saw it in the game, but you see it in practices too. So those were some of the guys that, like I said, I think are really, you're having conversations about now, where some of them I don't think you were having conversations about necessarily all that long ago. And as far as Hellams goes, that's an interesting conversation, because a lot of people think, and you know this, draft pick equals roster spot. That is not true. Like, some places it is, but when you're talking about a 7th round pick, that's not true at all, because the investment is minimal other than a draft pick, right? And anything 5th, 6th, or 7th round, those are dart throws, y'all. Like that's what it always is. But DeMarcco Hellams has proven himself. I think he's played really well. To me, he's in a 4th safety competition with Micah Abernathy. And then also he's in a special teams competition with a whole boatload of guys for probably 1 or 2 spots there. So if he can play well enough on defense and then show some special teams work and some special teams value, and he got first team special teams work in this game, now not full first team, because some of those first teamers that we know, like a Cordero Hodge, didn't play, that could really help him get to a roster spot.
Okay. So, guys, there's still more to come on today's episode with Mike Rothstein, including on why Scotty Miller may not be as big a lock for the roster as we thought. It is August, and that means it is fantasy draft season, and Underdog Fantasy is the easiest place to play fantasy football this year, because it is the best place to play best ball. Now, if you're an experienced fantasy player, you know the feeling of frustration when a guy on your bench goes off, or a starter, fizzles that week, and you don't have to worry about that with best ball, because Underdog is going to set your lineup for you. And if you're new to fantasy, I think best ball is probably the best way to get your feet wet playing fantasy football, because it's just one draft, no waivers, no trades, just set it and forget it. And the best way to enter is with Underdog's Best Ball Mania tournament, the largest fantasy football contest of all time. It's back with $15 million in total prizes up for grabs, including an absurd $3 million going to the winner. So, dip your toes into fantasy by visiting underdogfantasy.com, or find them in the App Store and sign up with the promo code Locked On when you do, and you'll get your first deposit doubled up to $100. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code Locked On. So you mentioned, we just discussed some of the guys that are sort of working their way to a roster spot, but you kind of mentioned in passing that there may be some guys that aren't sort of the locks that people thought they were, or, sounds like you're saying there could be a couple of guys that could be surprise cuts. Who are those?
Potentially, yeah. I've said this for a while, and I could be wrong. I could be dead wrong on it. I mean, Scotty Miller to me is a guy that would not shock me if we found out that on roster cut down day that he didn't make the 53. Because if you look at it, like in all seriousness, look at who played and who didn't the other night. Who's one of the few veterans that people think are roster locks that played? Scotty on offense. Scotty Miller.
Yeah.
So to me, a guy like Frank Darby, for instance, if Frank Darby outplays Scotty Miller, you got to remember, like, you might say, okay, Scotty Miller's their slot. He's their slot. No, he's not. Bijan Robinson's their slot receiver. Drake London can play in the slot. Kyle Pitts can play in the slot. They like what Cordero Hodge does on special teams. And you've heard Arthur Smith say they have bigger expectations and bigger hopes for Cordero Hodge. So it becomes a numbers game. I'm just saying, I'm saying I think Scotty Miller might be a little bit more roster bubbly than what people think, because look at the receiver numbers right now. Drake London on the team. Mac Hollins on the team. You can argue Kadarius Hodge. I don't know if he got hurt at all during the week because I wasn't in Miami. But if you didn't play in P1, you're probably on the team if you're a vet and somebody who they like and has been on that first field the whole time. So those three guys I think are pretty set, right?
Mm-hmm.
That leaves two spots. Is it possible Scotty Miller ends up in one of the spots? Absolutely, because he offers a speed dynamic. Is it possible that those guys are special teamers too, so you need to maybe look somewhere else? Yeah, absolutely. I'm just saying it doesn't seem to me like that's a 100% guarantee. If I had to do a roster construction today, he would be on there, but it's more of a thought process than a no-brainer to me. There are a couple of other guys that I'm curious. Like I saw who played and who didn't. Now I think Parker Hesse played a lot in part because he's still a younger guy. He's still learning the position, and he's more their blocking guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that to me told me something as well, because obviously Pitts didn't play, Jonnu didn't play. I don't think I saw Michael Pruitt in the game. I'd have to go back and look.
I didn't notice him.
Yeah, I mean, so and I imagine they'll keep 4 tight ends just because of how they're built. And Pitts and Jonnu can play multiple positions for sure. I mean, even Pruitt can to an extent because he can become a fullback. So that's something that's interesting to me. I'll be curious to see what they do at the fullback position because they have multiple guys that can kind of rotate into an H-back situation, like a Jonnu, like a Michael Pruitt, like a Parker Hesse. But Keith Smith gives them a lot of special teams too. So those are, I'm just saying, like those are some guys that you sit there and say, oh, he's definitely on the team. I'm not there yet with some of those guys. Defensively, I think the top end guys we know. I don't think there'll be any shocks there. Like to me, an Ade Ogundeji, if you think he's a roster lock, you probably haven't been paying attention. He's had to have a really good camp. I thought it was quite interesting that Arnold Ebiketie played a lot. Now, I can't see them moving on from him, but it was striking to me that he played a lot. Now, some of that might have been a numbers game because they are kind of thin at edge, and they're thin, frankly, at middle linebacker as a whole. I think they're kind of thin at, right, Aaron? Like, I mean, inside linebacker for sure. So I think that's why we saw a lot of Michael Walker, for instance. But those two spots, they're a little thin, and they probably want to get some of those guys some work in the defense. But again, that's what I was looking at in a game when we know that a lot of starters didn't play, their projected starters didn't play. Who played a lot stood out to me that they need to get a longer look at them.
Okay. So, guys, we will continue wrapping up today's episode with Mike Rothstein talking about sort of who and what he is looking forward to in the Falcons' upcoming second preseason matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, football season is about to kick off, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to win all season long because right now, when you bet on a Super Bowl winner, you get bonus bets back every time they win in the regular season. Just pick any team to win the Super Bowl, and you'll get bonus bets back after every victory. You can use those bonus bets on spreads, player props, such as Bijan Robinson, Offensive Rookie of the Year, over-unders, and so much more. If you want to bet on the Falcons, their current Super Bowl odds are plus 5,500, which means if you bet, say, $200 on the Falcons to win the Super Bowl, you will win $11,000. But not only that, you're also going to get bonus bets for every time the Falcons win this year. So enter by visiting FanDuel.com/lockedon and start earning your bonus bets with America's #1 sportsbook. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. My last question for you, Mike, is what are you looking forward to this week against the Bengals? Is this, I think most fans are, let's see what these starters can do.
Yeah.
Are you of a similar mind, or is there something else that you have your eyes on?
I mean, listen, the key for preseason, Aaron, the most important thing that happens on Friday night against Cincinnati is this. They come out of the game healthy. The coaches will tell you that. The players will tell you. If you kind of, gave them truth serum or whatever, they will tell you the most important thing is that they get out healthy. And then every team I say it, and I think I've said it last year on your podcast. I think I said it the year before on your podcast. The most important thing of preseason is that you get to week 1 with your starting 22, still your starting 22. And that's, and already we've got questions with the Falcons with Jeff Okudah and when he'll be back. But they have Trey Flowers, and Trey Flowers, I think, has held up okay so far in that spot. But, they're one injury away now at corner from there are some major questions then. So, first is health. Second is I'm curious to see how Desmond Ridder handles things as the full-time starter with the number ones. I'll be curious to see how much, if at all, Kyle Pitts plays, although the way Arthur Smith has talked, it sounds like they will get him some preseason work at some point. So I imagine that will be Friday. I'm curious to see what the first teamers look like. I'm more curious than anything else to see what the rotations are beyond it. Because, again, we know who the starters are. We know what they're going to be. They're not going to be running all this exotic stuff. They're not going to run 90% of the stuff they're going to try to run in games because they don't want to tip off opponents, especially with what they're trying to do offensively this year. So I'm curious to see who's getting in maybe with the ones in that first unit. Like, do we see Clark Phillips push his way a little more, right? Do we see what is that left tackle or not left tackle? We know who the left tackle is. Left guard. It's early Sunday morning, man. What does that left guard situation look like if Matt Hennessy is back? Like, has Matthew Bergeron done enough in the last week and a half to push that? Or does Matt Hennessy come back and get that shot again? Again, good problem to have if Bergeron has overtaken Hennessy, because I know I'm in the minority here, but Matt Hennessy can play a bit. He really can. People forget that he was practicing and training as a center all the way up until they made him a left guard in the middle of last year. So that's a good problem to have if you're them. What is a punt returner? Does the Alford now kind of solidify that as a punt return and do some guys that maybe we're not expecting, as I said, get some work with the first unit and rotate in with the first unit? Like, does a job who's that fourth and fifth receiver? Going to that Scotty Miller question, right? Who's that fourth and fifth receiver and sixth receiver that's getting work with the starters on Friday?
Mm-hmm.
Is there somebody that we don't expect to see that's getting work in there with that group? Because that means they want to get a good look at him in terms of how he would fit in with their unit that they would be using on game days when it matters.
Okay. Well, Mike, I think you did an excellent job giving us some food for thought all week long that I'm sure I will be exploring on this podcast.
Oh man. So all right. So is this how it works? I say things and then instead of us getting into a conversation, then you just tear me apart where I can't defend myself?
No. I come on this podcast and I say, Mike Rothstein said this, and it's Mike Rothstein's opinion rather than my opinion. So you can't come at me for that opinion. You just
but it's conversation, man. It's good. I do a lot of radio for ESPN. I'm a fill-in host on ESPN Radio. You can hear me actually most of this coming week on ESPN Radio in varying time slots, including with Harry Douglas. I think I'm on with Harry 12 to 3 on Thursday and Friday. But I mean, it's good conversation, man. I like varying opinions because that's the thing is that too often with fan bases, people get groupthink and it becomes this hive mind. And that's just not the reality of stuff. And I think that's where it gets fan bases kind of in situations. Like, I mean, not to go down this road, but Jalen Mayfield, right?
Okay.
I think Jalen Mayfield's going to make this team. As a tackle. Now, there will be a segment, both you and I know, of this fan base that will lose their minds if Jalen Mayfield's on the 53-man roster. Well, it's like, yeah, but Jalen Mayfield's playing his natural position now. He's looked okay, and he's not a starter. So take a deep breath and relax. Like, same thing that you didn't see the starters play. Like, I've been practicing Zen a lot. I've been trying to be more Zen, meditate more this year. I recommend that for others. Zen. It's just the preseason. Don't freak out. Don't flip out. Like, if you only see the starters for a quarter and a half, don't be like, why didn't they play the whole game? Like, people were like, well, it's good enough for Patrick Mahomes. Sure. But Patrick Mahomes played 1 or 2 series. I don't believe they had joint practices. Like, that's the other part of it, too. Be some people like, well, they had joint practice against the Jets, and then the starters played. Yeah, well, that was also the second preseason game, not the first. So anyway, sorry, rant over. But I'm just saying, it's just preseason, y'all. Like there's going to be things to be annoyed about, I'm sure. to both Friday night and at points during the season. But just remember, it's preseason. Take everything you see with the tiniest grain of salt. Teams that have been 4-0 in the preseason, like the Detroit Lions in 2008, then did not win a game the entire regular season. Teams that go winless in the preseason have also had success in the regular season. So,
did you cover that 08 Lions team?
No, I did not. Okay. I avoided. I've been a purveyor of a lot of bad football, Aaron. I really have. I covered Notre Dame in the Charlie Weiss era. I covered 2 years of Rich Rodriguez and 2 years of Brady Hoke at Michigan, and then I covered the Lions for 8 years. We were talking about this the other day. I have never covered. Now I've covered the NFL. This will be season 11, I think, and then I covered 8 years of college football. I have never covered a home playoff game. I have never covered a playoff win. I have never covered in the NFL a divisional champion. I have not covered a team that has had a winning record since the 2017 season. So
it's your fault.
What? Oh, I mean, yeah. I mean, I've covered some of the worst stretches of football for two of the most storied programs in college football. There are times I just sit there and I'm like, you know what? Maybe I am the dark cloud of sadness or the wet blanket of reason. But we'll see what happens this year with the Atlanta Falcons. I'm of the belief they're going to be pretty good, but we shall see.
Okay. Well, if the people want to come for you with their pitchforks and the torches, where can they find your stuff?
You can find me at Mike Rothstein on what I now call Twix, because Twitter and X, they can't figure it out. So we're just going to call it Twix. I'm trying to make it a thing, Aaron. I'm trying to make it a thing wherever I talk. So I'm at Mike Rothstein on Twix. I'm at Mike Rothstein on Threads. I'm at Mike Rothstein on Instagram. I have a TikTok account I don't use that is also Mike Rothstein. I just follow Kadero Hodge and watch his funny videos on TikTok. Yeah, I think that's about it. And obviously read all my stuff at ESPN.com, and you can occasionally hear me on ESPN Radio Sirius XM Channel 80.
So, guys, I want to thank Mike Rothstein for joining us on today's episode. And let's talk about the most recent roster move for the Atlanta Falcons. They signed USFL Defensive Player of the Year Frank Ginda at linebacker on Sunday and waived linebacker Michael Walker to make room for him. That was a bit of a surprise to me. I know to many other people all offseason long, they've been speculating that Michael Walker was, potentially on the roster bubble. I never really bought into that. While he was an underwhelming starter, that felt to me like that still is probably a guy that's an ideal backup. You have about 3,000-ish career snaps among your entire linebacker core as it currently stands, and Michael Walker accounted for about 40% of those snaps, and so that's a lot of experience walking out the door given the amount of unproven guys up to this point. And the other factor I thought made Michael Walker relatively safe was his versatility, being able to play multiple linebacker positions. We saw that on Friday night against the Dolphins, where he played both Sam linebacker and weak side linebacker in that game. And it wouldn't have shocked me to see like Nate Landman leapfrog him on the depth chart, but I didn't see enough from like Andre Smith and Tay Davis and Mike Jones Jr. in that Dolphins preseason game to make me think that Walker was on the bubble, and those guys were going to bring a lot more to the table. But potentially maybe that's where Frank Ginda comes into the conversation. As I said, the reigning USFL Defensive Player of the Year. He's kind of bounced around the NFL as well as some of those lower leagues the last 5 years since being an undrafted free agent out of San Jose State back in 2018. He played in the AAF in 2019, the XFL in 2020. The last 2 years has been in the USFL. The last time he was in an NFL camp until today was with the New Orleans Saints back in 2019. And so when it comes to Michael Walker, I'll own that mistake. I'll eat that plate of crows, probably like the fourth time I've been wrong in my lifetime. So we'll see if the Falcons, are looking for more veteran help at that linebacker position, in a couple of weeks when, they're scouring the waiver wire with 4 final cuts about 2 weeks from now. But I would imagine if they were valuing experience, they probably wouldn't have let Michael Walker go out the door. But them releasing him today does give him a better opportunity to catch on with another NFL team before those final cuts. And I would imagine that, if the Falcons will just kind of roll with the youth that they have, and trust in linebacker coach Frank Bush's ability to sort of develop those guys or get those guys ready to play if the need should arise later this season. So we'll see what's in store at that position, guys. Tomorrow's episode, we'll be joined by Adnan Ikic of the Falcoholic to talk more about this most recent preseason matchup and his thoughts on, I guess the state of the Falcons roster, and maybe get more into the Michael Walker decision, as well as other topics. So continue to make us your first listen. For your second listen today, why not check out the Locked On NFL podcast, where you can get the lowdown on all the first game action for all 31 other NFL teams in addition to the Atlanta Falcons. And of course, you can find Locked On NFL on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.